our module entitled Emerging Leadership and the Future of the Black Church. Joining with me in conversation today is Minister Aria Kirkland Harris. Minister Kirkland Harris was licensed to preach the gospel and exercise her gifts in ministry by the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia, where she currently serves as their Director of Stewardship and Community Development. She is also the Womanist Graduate Fellow at the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary, where she studies Black women's approaches to achieving economic independence. Minister Kirkland Harris recently joined the Gift of Black Theological Education and Black Church Collaborative, where she is co-creating initiatives designed to engage emerging generations in the work of preserving and sustaining the prophetic legacies of historic African-American churches and historically Black theological institutions. So we are excited for today's conversation. Minister Kirkland Harris.
Thank you, Reverend Boyd, my fellow Virginia Union Proctor alum, classmate, friend. It's good to be back as kind of a continuation of our module that we had back in the first week in May. So thank you all for joining that module. If you didn't listen to it, please go back and watch the full video. It was a great conversation. And we're looking forward to kind of addressing some of the questions that we weren't able to get to in that conversation today. But before we jump into the questions, I think it would be good just to give kind of a brief synopsis of what we talked about back in May. And so as, forgive me, I'm gonna call him Jamar because we know each other, but as Reverend Boyd, Jamar might flip back and forth, mentioned that the title of that module is Emerging Generations and the Future of Black Church Leadership. And in that conversation, we're really shifting from this idea of emerging generations. We defined emerging generations as millennials and Gen Z, but that's a wide range of ages kind of like in that grouping. And so most of the fellows, actually for the collaborative, are millennials, and some of us are in our 40s and up. And so we don't really feel like emerging, like we're here, so that we've shifted the conversation from emerging generations to emerging leaders. And there's kind of two questions that we wanted to answer in that module, two guiding questions. One was, what do emerging leaders or emerging generations, emerging leaders want to hear from the church? And what does the church need to hear from emerging generations? I hear that a lot as I talk to folks, like what do young people want to hear from us? Like our elders say, what do young people want to hear from us in order to come back to the church? And so we'll talk about some of the messages that we want to hear and what we also want to see and feel. But I think it's also important in the same way for the church to hear from us and say, what does the church need to understand and hear from us as emerging leaders to know that the future of the church is safe and that we care about it, and what maybe even some of the hurts that we've experienced, and what would it take for us to re-engage. And so it's this kind of dual conversation between what does church need to hear and what do emerging generations need to hear. And then we used, to kind of frame the conversation, we used Nehemiah, the beginning of chapter 1 and the end of chapter 2, where the young prophet Nehemiah, who is still in Babylon after the exile, is asking about the state of his people back home in Jerusalem. And so we find him weeping and mourning and praying and fasting over the destruction of Jerusalem and the wall and the state of the people who stayed behind. And so he intercedes on their behalf and has this idea and goes back to the community at the end of chapter 2 and says, okay, come, let us rebuild together. He says, you see the trouble that we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And the people respond saying, yes, let us rebuild. And so that kind of Nehemiah's petition is really at the core of what we're talking about in this module and this podcast as emerging leaders coming back home to the church, or some of us have never left, but some of us are coming back home, saying, we see the state of things, we see the state of the Black church, and we are concerned. And so come, let us all rebuild together. And there's some internal relational work that needs to happen across generations that we need to do as we are doing this work, maybe even before we move to the next phase of this rebuilding work. And so that's what we're talking about, these kinds of, are there intergenerational barriers that we need to address, or biases that we need to dismantle or unpack, so we can really do this intergenerational work together of rebuilding the Black church, because we need everybody in this thing together. So we will start to jump into some of the questions from audience members that were asked. And I think the first one that I would like to address was, and we brought it up in the podcast, but we'll talk about it again, was this idea of reclamation, where someone asked, can reclaiming be included in the recruitment and retention strategy for millennial and Gen Z generations? This idea, and I love that idea of elders saying, you are our children, and you are our people, we are reclaiming you. And this idea of elders coming after us and being and pursuing and caring about where we are and wanting to bring us back in. And in the same way, I use that reclamation language when I talk to emerging leaders and my fellow millennials, friends that have left to say, come, let's reclaim our inheritance that is the Black church. The faith of the elders that got us through all kinds of horrors. Like we all know the stories, but the hardships and the challenges and the institutional and systemic exclusionary policies and all of that are slavery, we'll just name it. Slavery in America and what it means to be a Black person in America, the faith that carried us through all of that. So let's reclaim that. Let's reclaim the land and the buildings and the space as sacred space for emerging leaders. And then while our elders are in turn reclaiming us. So I don't know if Jamar, I don't know if you had any response to that kind of sense of reclamation. Does that language resonate with you or other folks that you've talked to, or have you heard that before?
Yeah, no, I think you seemingly gave the same answer that I'm going to give. I don't think there's a great line of difference in your response to what mine would be or is. I think in understanding reclamation, there has to be also the ability to understand there's mutual commitment, mutual engagement, mutual vulnerability, if you will, to be able to see and name the present state of the church, but also identifying that one's re-entering through the process of reclamation allows for new vision, new opportunities, new space creation, either for emerging generations or present generations that are in the church, especially elders, because elder care is still a real thing, right? Even in crafting these new approaches and new engagement opportunities for millennials and Gen Z, there still has to be care for elders. Reclamation allows for the formation of all of that. So with that said, I think the natural next question probably is a how-to question. So with reclamation being the first question, the how to engage, encourage, and recruit a younger generation of leaders in the Black church. How do we do that? That's such a loaded question that I don't know if we have enough time to even scratch the surface of what each person would mean when they say how, along with how each person is even defining younger generation, because somebody would describe Gen X as younger generation because they're under 60, right? So, and all millennials are not everybody under 50, so there's like the understanding of that too. I think like reclamation is a part of that, right? Like that's a legit part of engagement and encouraging in a process of recruiting of younger leaders in the Black church. But I think there has to be a level of deep transparency and relationship building that will foster not so much leadership from younger generations, but it will foster just the initial engagement of younger generations back into or in proximity to the church. I think we lost that as Black Americans, quote unquote, began to immerse themselves in middle-class America, into the overall colonial project, if you will, where we began to move to the suburbs, right? And we began to seemingly detach ourselves from either urban realities or rural realities, right? And so there also has to be, in the process of reclamation as a strategy of recruitment, it is telling the stories, right? It is the truth-telling stories that Arya even highlighted earlier of our congregations, and that helping them to understand the Black church is a space of convergence. It's a space of diversity and variety. And even your engagement strategies, your encouragement, and your recruitment has to be the same thing. So that's a short answer for me. What are your thoughts?
No, it's the same. It's like there's so many things that you mentioned, and even in that question, I think one that point about when we talk about how do we engage or encourage or recruit younger generations, that idea of younger or older is so subjective, right? So it's like I'm 38, so it's like anybody younger than me is young, and then everybody older than me is old. And so my 12-year-old niece thinks I'm old, and then church members in their 80s call me a baby. So it's like, what is it? So it is kind of this younger, but I'm assuming I think it's safe to assume for these purposes that younger means, millennials. Maybe it may even mean Gen X. Really, it could mean anybody under 55 or so. But but to that point, I think one of my suspicion is that there's some kind of like low-hanging fruit. I don't even, for lack of a better term. I think there are some people who are at the margins that may be easier to re-engage than others, right? So for example, I say that people who grew up in church but have left may be easier to re-engage because they're kind of tangentially watching. So out of my friends that I grew up with in church, I'm the only one who's still engaged in everyday life of a church. One, because it's my job, right? I'm a minister, but also I was a preacher's kid, so I'm sure that had something to do with it in the long run. But my friends and I have a group chat that we all grew up in church together, but none of us go back to our home church except when we're home for the holidays. But we still get all the paperwork about business meetings. We ask each other, like, did you hear, did you hear what happened? And so that group who's there and close by may be easier to re-engage. There are a lot of seminarians, like I'm the only woman in my graduating class who's working in full-time ministry. But there are a lot of, and I think some of that deconstructing that happens like in seminary, right, where you unlearn everything that you knew to be true, and they tell you it was not all a lie, but they say, what if that wasn't true? Do you still have faith? But but some people are still struggling with that deconstruction of their faith and are finding it hard to then re-engage in the life of the church. And so I think that group of people who have, and even the people who access resources, the internet is out there now. So the texts that we read in seminary are really available to everyone. And as people start to think about and start to grapple with the truth of the Christian or slavery as a Christian project or a church sanctioned project, what does that mean for Black folks when we are dealing with that reality? And then how do you then in turn engage this inherited faith with that reality there? And I think there's some people who've been in that work, and we talk about it in seminary and the books are out there, but I think because of the internet and because of our times in terms of the movement for Black lives, people are engaging that on a wider scale. And so they need a place to ask those questions and to challenge what they've always believed, but still be able to be in church. And so I think that is actually one way that what if churches had some kind of seminary level conversations where we talk about, Black liberation theology, or we talk about, in the writings about America's civil religion, or just, womanist theology, or what kind of the new emerging theologies where people can engage different lines of thought in church. I think that would also be a way to engage younger generations because they're asking these questions, but they're not asking them in church. And so if the church did engage them in that way, they might be a little more open to coming back and not just feeling like they would be shut down right away. Yeah. But I was thinking about, the question of the movement for Black lives actually came up in relation to the role of the church. So, I was thinking about the Henry Louis Gates and Skip Gates documentary on PBS about the Black church. This is Aria's interpretation, but I interpreted the end of that series. I think it's available on PBS if folks still want to go watch it. This is Aria's stuff. We're not sponsoring anything, but at the end of the film, I understood it was they made this statement as basically like the Black church has left the building, saying the movement has gone out into the streets. And I was just like, wait, is that just how this ends? Like the movement used to be in the church and now it's in the street and that's it? So I wonder, Jamar, you're an activist, you work at the Proctor Conference, you worked at the NAACP. What do you have to say about the movement for Black lives in relation to all of this, like the future of the Black church?
Yeah, no, I think it almost parallels so much with this question of young leaders, right? And emerging generations. It's the same parallel when it comes to organizing in the streets, right? Of if you're going to look at your traditional institutional Black churches, it's almost looking at them through the same lens of looking at your historic institutional grass top Black grassroots organizations, right? Your NAACP, your Urban League, your other, I don't want to keep naming, but your other orgs, right? Where they are our traditional grass top organizations. They're going to have a gala every year, you're going to have a good Freedom Fund dinner, you know, but you're raising the questions of relevance, of purpose, the mission, and who is the target audience, right? And that's the same, seemingly it's the same question you're asking the church, right? Like, what is your relevance? What is your target audience? What is your mission? Why are you advocating for us to re-engage or to engage you collectively if we potentially have it in the future? And I think what you saw with Black Lives Matter and what you're seeing presently with the state of apathy and pessimism, if you will, is the resistance of folks. Nobody wants to do the status quo of just convening for the sake of convening. And then, okay, we're going to engage a topic, but never actually build solutions, right? And so the church found itself at a critical point of engagement inquiry, if you will. Like, are we really going to engage these kids in the street who are talking about abolition, deconstruction, defund, pro women, pro LGBTQ? I mean, we really about to do this because the Bible says, right? It's just like, but that's not even the communal ethic of Black folk, right? So like, there's this conundrum of the church trying to figure out with our conservative theologies and our moderate to progressive social ethics and social politics, what do we do with this? And I think you just saw a large group of folks were like, you know what? While my church and my pastor may not be protesting, and while they may not be crossing the bridge, and they're not sitting in these organizing meetings and developing 3 and 10-point plans and strategies and long-term solutions, I will. And so I think we have to add nuance to that to say, there is somebody in the pew who is engaging the work in the streets. And it just may not be the pastor. It may not be somebody on staff. The other part to that is, I've said before, it's actually okay for the church not to be in the front, but it's a non-negotiable for the church not to be present. So the church can be adjacent, it can be undergirding, it can be in the back, but the church has to be present. And as African people, spirituality is always at the center of it. I mean, there's some God present somewhere in the movement. And so the church just has to figure out, are you more committed to your institutional politics and your doctrinal positions, which we will get to in a minute, or do you really center the congregation and the people that you're called to serve and the community in which you're located? Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to, when we think about engaging young people, I'm laughing because I guess I fall in that cat. No, but when we talk about engaging,
We're so young, Aria.
right? I'm still young. I'm looking at, well, anyway, I got this gray streak in my hair. Like I don't feel it, but no, I accept it. People tell me that I'm young, so I say thank you. But yes, no, as we engage younger generations, especially ones, and I think. And when we talk about people who are kind of the low-hanging fruit or the easiest groups to be engaged, I think that activists should be some of the easiest to re-engage because of that spirit that's calling for freedom. There is a spirit within them that is saying, we are going, who believe in freedom will not rest until it comes. And to the spirit that pushes them to continue fighting and pressing in the face of all of the opposition and oppression. And so that is real faith and spirit. And so they should be one of the easiest groups to re-engage. And I wonder if there is a way for the church to re-offered as a kind of both a refuge of just one, because my friends who are regular activists on the lines are tired. physically, spiritually, mentally, and they need a place of refuge and safety to come. So could the church be that in some kind of way? And two, just a training for the elders, like, because I was like, I don't know how to do this, but I know there's some elders in here who are maybe in their 80s and don't physically can't be out there anymore, even though some of them are, but that can say this is how we did things, right? So I had the privilege of sitting with Otis Moss Jr., Otis Moss Jr., the third's father, it was another conference, and they did one of these lunch and learn things with the elders, and it was just him in a room, and we could ask him questions. And he was talking about how one of the reasons why the movement was led by Black clergy was because they didn't have debt, because back in the day, you know, they didn't take out student loans for seminary, and they wouldn't get fired from their jobs for being arrested because their churches would bail them out. And I'm like, that makes perfect sense, because people like it happened here in Richmond that a young woman who was arrested, job found out, and she was fired, and that was published in the paper before she even found out. And so there are certain things that the church can offer, just in terms of training and in terms of refuge, and just community, that I think that could be offered in that space. So I think that's another thing to throw out for someone else to figure out how to do. And I do want to throw out too, just for folks, for people who are listening that really want to talk about, we didn't spend a lot of time in the module talking about Gen Z, and those are the teenagers and some like young college kids. I think millennials stop around, the youngest millennials are I think around 25 or 26. And so college students are Gen Z. But there is an organization called the Youth, it's actually supported by the Lilly Endowment also, who supports the collaborative, the Youth Theology Institute. We had it at Virginia Union, and it was basically, I call it a church camp, but it was the local high school students came to Virginia Union. I think it's all rooted in seminaries, where the institute is hosted at the seminary. High school students come to the seminary for a week and stay overnight on campus. And we really engage these high school kids in like deep theological discussions. Like they were reading Howard Thurman and talking about, I'm blocking the name of it. The Sound of the Genuine, thank you. But they were asking deep questions. And I think that's a brilliant model, or even if you don't send kids away for a week, but just the work of Almeda Wright, who's at Yale Divinity School, and she wrote a book called The Spiritual Lives of Young African Americans, and now she's working on a church-based kind of Sunday school curriculum called Black Joy. But there are resources out there and kind of models for engaging younger and young people, generations in the church. But the bottom line is the internet has made everything accessible to them. So 12 and 13-year-olds are reading graduate level text and articles, because when they want to know something, they just Google it. And they may find great resources and they may find poor resources. And so it's really up to the church to kind of step out of our comfort zone, because it can be scary to engage, a 12-year-old in some of these conversations. But if they're asking the questions, we have to do it. And so there are resources out there. So please look out for those when you're talking about engaging like teens and adolescents in theological conversations, but that's definitely a part of it.
I was going to ask you, Arya, I think you are on this trend of answering one of the questions, and I hope people can see solutions in everything that Arya has uplifted, because Arya, basically, you just gave us like a 5-point strategy on how to strengthen intergenerational relationships in church. So if y'all listening, Arya is like clearly the solution builder in this.
I'm about to say, run those back. Did I give 5?
Yeah. It might be 5. I'm just saying 5. But I mean, you legit laid out how to strengthen intergenerational relationships in the church. I mean, stemming from this question on the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Or Black Lives, what the Black Lives Matter movement created. I think like, the other part to this is COVID excavated a lot of truths that we just didn't want to talk about. Like, if you really want to know what millennials think about church, you found out in COVID. I mean, you really found out, but not just millennials and not just Gen Z, the younger generation. You also found out what elders valued most in church. And hearing from my great-grandmothers and my grandparents in general, it had nothing to do about worship. Like, it had everything to do about just being in community, right? Like being in relationship And that church was the one time a week I knew I was going to see Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so who I had not seen in the last 6 days or 7 days, right? So this question for me about strengthening intergenerational relationships in the church is almost redundant, because the Black church has modeled that almost better than any other institution that I could think of. I mean, I grew up Baptist, right? So if you grew up Baptist, we had Baptist Training Union, you had Vacation Bible School, but on a normal Sunday, you had Sunday school, you had worship, you had a break, you went back for afternoon service, and you might have had another break before you went back for a night service in the summer, right? But in all of that was this intergenerational conference and convergence, where in Sunday school, you had the teacher from a local elementary school or a local principal. They were teaching you in Sunday school, and they were teaching you public speaking. I learned about finances when I had to do the Sunday school count, after service.
Like treasure.
Yeah, like that was my first experience, right? But all of that was intergenerational relationships, which segues into one of our next questions. What does succession planning entail other than deliberate appointment by the pastor?
Yeah. So I think that succession planning language is easy for me because in my previous pre-call to ministry life, I was a management consultant for nonprofits and nonprofit boards. And so a lot of times I apply those kind of strategies to work in the church. And so succession planning is simply identifying the key leadership roles in your congregation and making a plan for filling those roles once the current leaders move on, whether it's retirement or their 2 or 3 years is up, whatever the bylaws say. But it's really like, okay, you have all these leadership positions within the church. If all those people retire, do you have a pool of people who are ready to step in? And so, and it's interesting because I think there is a gap, right? So we have, in addition to all the Baptist Training Union and Vacation Bible School and all of that, there's the Youth Usher Board, Junior Missionaries, Youth Choir. I think so. I remember we had the Pastoral Relations Committee always had a youth representative. So youth get experience, but I think there may be a gap between filling those roles or serving those positions when we were in grade school. And we go away, some of us go away for college, or we just go away and explore and then come back, later on. But there's this gap in the kind of 20s and 30s of what does that next phase of training and preparation for leadership look like? And I know, so traditionally mainline denominations have their own processes, like at least for ministers, there's the ordination process, right? So I'm American Baptist by tradition. And when you accept the call to ministry, one of the first, once you have that conversation with the diaconate and the pastor, then you go to seminary, and that's 3 years of preparation. And then you do CPE, clinical pastoral education, and you may work in a hospital as a chaplain or something like that. And then when you're a licensed candidate for ministry, that's at least 6 months, but up to 4 years of being a licensed candidate for ministry, where you kind of, and in seminary, you have a pastoral internship where you serve a church. But I'm a licensed minister. So that means I teach Bible study, I shadow the pastor and the associate pastor when we prepare for funerals and baptisms and baby dedications. I go to those meetings with the family. Then I may lead parts of the service. I have to preach, I have to lead Bible study, I attend all the meetings. And so there are all of that, plus what you have to go through in ordination in terms of writing the papers and getting questioned before the council. So denominations have systems, for at least for ministers. And I think I can't really speak to Methodist polity, but what the elder track looks like, but I know they have processes too. But a lot of folks, I have a lot of friends who say they don't want to jump through those hoops. Personally, I'm okay with it because I see it as a way of building relationships so the church can see that I'm committed to the church and the process and the tradition. But I think there are politics involved in all of that. There's hard work involved, and often, I shouldn't say my church is a paid position. I'm very thankful, but sometimes that role is unpaid. and it's worked. And so I do wonder if there's a way to kind of update that type of succession planning, or how to make that more open or transparent or inclusive. I honestly, I don't know the answer to that. There's some bishops and more people with authority in the collaborative and the deans and presidents that can answer those questions. But it's really important it's that mentorship issue, right? So like I was talking to one of our deacons today, and there was a new member at our church who's about maybe 35 or 36, and she was like, "Oh, he can make a good deacon." And so she already has in her mind that he's going to be a deacon, and I know she will intentionally reach out to him and engage him, and invite him out for lunch and do all of those things. But it really takes elders to one, see talent, or to see gifts, or see potential, and that will be willing to invest their time in saying, "Hey, would you like to go out and come?" And that relationship building work. And so I think it would be smart to have people in the church who have the right spirit, who are engaging, who are discerning, who have time to develop talent, I'm sure that talent is like of the world kind of, who can nurture and help with discernment of the spiritual gifts of younger leaders, and really help them develop. But it really is about mentoring and having relationship with someone that you trust and you believe cares about you. So that's my take on succession planning. I don't know. I haven't been in a system that's a strictly pastoral appointment. Baptist folk vote.
Yeah, well, I'm Church of God of Christ now.
Okay.
And my grandmother's AME, so I've witnessed the pastoral appointment. Pros, cons, the good, the bad, right? But I think like there are some lessons to learn in congregational polity. I mean, now Baptist folk, we say we congregational, but depending on the context, it's either more pastor led or more deacon led. Just depending on the context.
No comment.
Yeah. But at Proctor, where Dr. Jeremiah Wright is one of our founders, he was pastor of a UCC church, right? Mm-hmm. Where while he was pastor and led his congregation, they're UCC. And so the congregation is fully involved in the success of the church, from its entities to its internal auxiliaries and its external partnerships. And so, potentially it's Black churches, smaller congregations looking at other models, right? And saying, what does it mean to have a deacon board where you have term limits, right? You have legit 3 to 5 year term limits. And you're required that 30% of your deacon board is under 40 or under 35, right? Like just being creative in that way. And that is a mode of succession planning, along with, there are some lay positions, like your usher president should not be president for 30 years. Like, again, that's a whole nother conversation.
It happens. We know it happens. Not in my church.
I'm gonna let you ask the next question.
Yeah, I think that the gist of it is like, I think it's all right for churches to do like to go to have for the leadership to say, like, look at all the roles in your church and say, do we have 2 or 3 people that could fill these positions, whether it's next year or in 5 years? And if not, make a plan. And you can have an intentional, leadership development program, or it doesn't have to be that structured, but just it's important to have intentional strategies and to have people who are in leadership say, I see you, I think you are gifted, and we want to help you develop. And that, just that acknowledgement in itself is powerful. So yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Let's see. I know we're shifting gears a little bit. And I'm hesitant I'm pausing to with this because I don't want to minimize this conversation, but in the module, both the questions beforehand and just in the conversations during, the question of inclusion and diversity keeps coming up. And depending on your context, that could mean different things. At one point, inclusion meant just Black folks getting in. And now for some churches, it's still a conversation of, do we allow or affirm women in leadership, or do we ordain women? And then the next generation is pushing it a step further to say, that our queer siblings or the LGBTQIA plus community needs to be welcomed and affirmed and safe in these spaces. Yeah, that's such, I mean, that conversation really deserves its own module or its own podcast and series with a variety of voices and lived experiences. And so I'm trying to, but I want to honor the fact that it keeps coming up. So I think just, is there a way to say, where does that fit in this conversation about young adults or millennials or emerging leaders? Like, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the reality before us, right? Where if the church is supposed to be a space for all people, welcoming of all people, affirming and including all people, but we have theological and doctrinal statements or positions that contradict that,
Mm-hmm.
we are literally living in a space of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Right. And people are calling that out or naming that rather, and forcing us to confront it. And I think you're hearing so many different positions without actually folks sitting down and having critical conversation and understanding the perspectives of those who have been oppressed and marginalized and or feel like they have just been discarded. And in some cases, they have legit been discarded.
Mm-hmm.
I think there has to be an openness of elders to understand two things for me, in short. One is I've heard older pastors, older bishops defend, oh, the Black church has always been inclusive. The Black church has always been welcoming. I don't know about that, right? Because I can identify a sermon in which you were selective or prohibitive in who comprised or who you believe comprised the body of the church, right? Along with this whole nation of God loves the sinner but hates the sin. What does that even mean, right? So these contradictory, hypocritical positions that are not fully inclusive, affirming, or display the love of God. That's one for me. The other part is really getting down to what makes the church so uncomfortable talking about sex, sexuality, and gender. Like, why is this so uncomfortable for you? And I think until we have that latter conversation, we can't even deal with the part of affirming and inclusive theologies. Until we can really get down to the why are you unable to have an honest, holistic conversation on sex, sexuality, and gender, in part is because it's one of the spaces where we are ignorant in the church. We are legit ignorant, because there's an inability to include science. There's an unwillingness to acknowledge and admit, well, I'm just going off of what the Bible says. But you don't do that for nothing else in your life.
But you're still eating shrimp.
Right. You don't do that for nothing else. Right. And also being honest about the fact, if we polled most Black churches, right, 75% of our churches are women, make up the base of our congregations. I've argued that if we took a blind poll, 1 in 3 of the members in our congregation would either identify as queer, gay, lesbian, bisexual, potentially transgender, and or have one of those persons as a member of their immediate family. I think if we did an honest blind poll, we would find 1 in 3, maybe more, have that in their truth ethic or confession. But I'm not the one to lead this conversation. Right? I'm not, because the one bias I have about myself is I'm a church kid. I've been in church all my life. And so there's going to be the continual advocacy for the church, and the shifting of the church and the progression of the church. And in that, I think there is a bias that you can have at times of not holistically hearing and listening and understanding the experiences and the truths of those who need to be centered most in the conversation.
Yeah. I know that's a really interesting, this idea of the blind poll of like, do you really, like, who's in your congregation? Because I'm choosing, some people, and forgive me because I hope no one is offended by this, but it does to me feel like, there's been kind of like a don't ask, don't tell policy in our churches.
Say
Like,
that
we
one
know.
more time. Say that one more time, because we know.
It is, right? And so, but I mean, so I think the challenge is in terms of this context, the challenge is that younger generations are not going to allow the issue to be skirted. We have to talk about it. And I think each generation has less tolerance than the generation that came before, right? So it's like tokenism. Like, so I'm not impressed. Yes, we celebrate Black folks being the first, but that doesn't impress me. I'm like, that's it? You only got one still? Like, so each generation wants more and is going to push it further. And this generation is requiring people to have the conversation and take a stance. So at the end of the day, it's, are you affirming or no? Do you love me or no? Are you going to condemn me to hell or no? And so, and it's really that simple. And so I think a lot of times with our statements and positions, like, it's just, at the essence, what's the answer? And they're going, and the kids are holding our feet to the fire in terms of answering that question. And so we have to have it. I think when I was in that Youth Theology Institute, I had a student who would come out as being pansexual. And she literally asked me, does this mean God doesn't love me anymore? And I was just like, first I was like, absolutely not. God loves you. But and I also told her, you have to talk to your parents, because she was 14 and I'm not her parent. And those conversations do need to happen within family. But if that's what our messages are telling our kids, that God doesn't, like, that's what they're hearing. They're hearing that God doesn't love them.
Yeah.
So like, that's not okay. That's a deal breaker. And so I think we have to have the conversation. But the issue is, do you believe I'm made in the image of God or not? Do you love me or not? Can I come and sit in your church as my full self or not? And you have to answer. And if you can't answer, people are walking away.
Aria, the other part of that too is like, the other part. I just got it. Like, again, another conversation for another module as we prepare to wrap this up. But like, the other part to that whole don't ask, don't tell part is, we sit in the congregation and we know you don't believe what you're preaching.
Yeah.
Right? Like, your contextual relationships and your proximal affirmations of other things outside of this church communicate to your congregation what you really believe. And so it goes back to this thing of, are you fearful that people are going to leave if you actually are honest about what you think God truly affirms and the divine positions as it relates to the creation, the variety, and the beauty of humanity? Like, I think that is a deep theological question for pastors and clergy to wrestle with as we are in this Kairos moment around inclusion, affirmation, and more affirming theologies that we believe would align with what God has.
Yeah. And because we also are focused on solutions, I do want, and because I'm still a somewhat recent seminary grad, when I have these conversations, I always refer back to Kelly Brown Douglas's work on the book Sexuality in the Black Church. And that helped me because I'm not going to do it justice, but one, get the book. And if you have and if you need help unpacking it, go to your local seminary or call us. We'll help you figure it out, how to make it relatable for folks who are not in seminary or aren't engaged in that type of work at this point yet, because there is some preparation that needs to happen. But she basically explains that, your sexuality is also your humanity. And by condemning someone's sexuality, you're condemning their humanity. And she also talks about, just the ways in which Black bodies are continually policed. And that is another, and so that kind of policing sexuality is another way of policing Black life and controlling and condemning. And so that is, I'm not doing it justice, but that book does a beautiful job of tracking the history of the trafficking and enslavement of Black bodies and all the politics and propaganda and really just insidious theologies and doctrine that are tied to those things, and then kind of unpacks us, hoping that we can get free. But I think, but there are resources to help. And it's kind of, and because people are at different points in this conversation. And so some folks, well, people are at different points in the conversation. And so you do need resources to help people go through the process. We have the privilege of being seminary grads. So we spent 40 hours a week for 3 years plus doing this work. But definitely sexuality in the Black church is also a resource. And ask for help. If you don't feel equipped to have the conversation, or if your grandchild or niece or nephew is coming to you with questions and you don't feel equipped to answer them, find someone who is, that you trust and who is has integrity and is not predatory in any way to help answer those questions, because our kids are asking them. The kids are asking them and need answers. The millennials already know the answers they want to hear, and if they don't, they're not going to engage. And so we have to have these conversations in the church. So yeah, I think that's our spiel, and hopefully we can have future conversations about that with folks who actually do this work full time. So yeah, so I know we're always mindful of time, and we got 2 Baptist preachers on here, so we're not going to have a 20-minute close. We have 5 times to say I'm almost finished, But I think as we think about kind of coming to the end of this conversation, we covered a lot of content. One, we always give thanks to the collaborative, the gift of Black Theological Education and Black Church Collaborative, which is supported by the Lilly Endowment and the Intrust Center for Theological Schools. We thank you all. To Dolores Brisbane, our Queen Mother and convener, we love you. And to all of our church folks and seminaries, we all love you too, and trust that you believe that we are sold out for Jesus. We are Bible, we were Bible believing saints, fire baptized, all of that. We love God and God's people. And so I hope that you do hear that love for the church in this conversation at the end of the day. And so just as a final question, one of the audience members from the module posed this question of, do we ever think that we are asking too much of the church? So as we are pushing these conversations forward and asking churches to engage in these hard conversations and kind of reconciliation and healing work, are we asking too much of the church? Are we asking the church to be something that it may not have the capacity to be or was intended to be? How would you respond to that?
My answer is absolutely not.
Yes.
We are not asking enough of the church. At Proctor, we take this position that the church should be the space of convergence. That word comes up so much here at Proctor, because seemingly at its height, right? And everybody will define the church, the Black church, at its height at different periods based upon their contextual relationship to the church and their age. But at its height, this was the very institution that built other institutions, whether they were educational institutions, medical centers, grocery stores, whatever you could think of, fostered itself out of a Black congregation, especially in some rural contexts. I think we have to, in this moment, ask ourselves, in response to that, for me, it's 3 things. Number one, what is our mission? Like what is the congregational mission, and what is our commitment to our community? Second thing would be, who are the people that comprise this congregation? I mean, that's all, everything we've been talking about today has been about the people in the pews and how they impact the community once they leave that congregation on Sunday or on Wednesday night. So who are the people in here, and what do they do Monday through Friday? I promise you, there's some entrepreneurs, some bank tellers, a bank exec, a teacher, a principal, a pharmacist, a CPA. Somebody is in your congregation that has some dope ideas, some tremendous solutions and points of engagement that have not been fostered or even considered as a potential option to cultivate new life for that congregation or for your congregation. So who's in your congregation? And the third thing is, why are we afraid to be something more? Like an honest question of, like, clearly what we're doing is not working. And I say that with the deepest respect, right? Like you're seeing the same people every week, right? You're doing the same work every year. And then for some people, that's not true, but for a lot of people, it is. And so, why are we afraid to acknowledge we're not doing enough? We don't know what to do. That's why you have young people in your church. That's why you engage the folks who aren't members of your congregations. And when I say young people, I'm not just talking about like the under 50, under 40. You know, the Bible does talk about babes in Christ. So there's somebody who just got saved as a part of your congregation that you have not even asked what they think the church should be doing. And budgets are real, right? Capital is a real thing. Assets are a real thing, but hands and feet are too. So, we're not doing enough. And there is so much more we could be doing. And the opportunities are endless.
Yeah, I agree. That the person who asked that question was saying, are we asking the church to do something that doesn't have the capacity to do, or to be something it wasn't intended to be? And again, I think we have the capacity to do whatever we want. It's limitless, exceedingly and abundantly beyond all that we could ask or think. But, I was talking to one of my professors, Dr. Faith Harris, womanist theologian, who used to be at Virginia Union. And I was, talking about and thinking about the Black church and all it was, like we remember at its height, this movement of the Black church. And, and thinking, can we go back? Like, is there a way to regain that? And she was just like, Aria, we can't go back to where we were. That time has passed, but it's yet to be defined what we will be. Right. And so we can't go back, but we can still dream about and decide what the future will be. That has not been defined for us yet. And so it is up to us, all generations, to acknowledge what you were saying, that, there are some things that are not working, but the Black church is not dead. We're still here. Some may be, well, anyway, that's not, some things need to die, but, we are still here. We are still here. And so we have the opportunity to define and to see and to hope and pray with expectation about what we will become. And it's our responsibility to engage that work thoughtfully. And so we pray that that people will do that work of thinking about, what do we hope for our future? And once you have that vision, start charting it out. Okay, how do we get there? And that's the work. So yeah, we have hope.
Praise the Lord.
Amen. We love you all. It's like, we got to go. May the Lord God bless you real good. But thank you all for listening. It is always a pleasure to do the work with the gift of Black Theological Education and Black Church Collaborative. So we will see y'all next time.